January 17, 1945. Ardennes Forest, eastern Belgium. The snow fell in silence, not the gentle drift of winter's grace, but the heavy, suffocating curtain that muffled the world into gray stillness. Along a muddy road carved through frozen pines, a German Panther tank sat motionless, its 50-ton hull tilted at an unnatural angle, one track buried deep in the frozen ditch. Steam rose from its engine compartment in ghostly wisps. Inside, the crew had long since abandoned it, their footprints already filling with fresh powder. The behemoth was silent now, a monument to its own immobility. Nearby, the faint rumble of an engine approached, not the guttural roar of a tiger or the grinding symphony of a panzer column, but something smaller, something that should not have mattered at all. It was the sound of a single jeep. What happened next would shatter every assumption the German army held about American weakness. But before we witness this impossible moment, make sure you're subscribed to channel and hit that notification bell, because the stories we uncover are the ones history tried to forget. To understand the shock that would unfold in the hours to come, one must first grasp what the Panther represented to the men who built it, crewed it, and believed in it. The Panzerkampfwagen Pfeffert Panther was not merely a weapon. It was the steel incarnation of German engineering supremacy, a 50-ton answer to the Soviet T-34, armed with a 75mm KWK-42 cannon capable of penetrating any Allied armor at ranges exceeding a mile. Its sloped frontal armor, 80mm thick at a 55-degree angle, could deflect shells that would evaporate lesser machines. When it rolled off the production lines at MAN and Daimler-Benz, each Panther carried with it the weight of national expectation. It was supposed to be unstoppable, and yet, here it sat, stuck. The German tankers who crewed these machines had been raised on a doctrine of mechanical invincibility. From the earliest days of the Panzerwaffe, they had been taught that German steel was harder, German guns more accurate, German tactics more refined. The victories of 1940 had seemed to prove this beyond doubt, entire nations collapsing in weeks before the synchronized fury of armor and air power. Even now, in the bitter winter of 1945, with the Reich contracting like a wounded animal, the men inside these tanks clung to the belief that their machines were superior. They had to be. If the Panther, the Tiger, the King Tiger were not invincible, then what had all the sacrifice been for? But belief does not move 50 tons of immobilized steel. And on this frozen morning, what arrived to challenge that belief was not another tank, not a recovery vehicle, not even a half-track. It was a Willys MB Jeep, weighing barely 2,400 pounds, worth $738.75 in U.S. military procurement records, crewed by two American soldiers who looked more like farmhands than conquerors. The Jeep that approached the stranded Panther that morning belonged to the 7th Armored Division's reconnaissance unit, a formation that had been harrying German positions throughout the Ardennes since the collapse of the winter offensive. The driver was a corporal from Ohio named Henry Dalton, a mechanic's son who had learned to coax life from dying tractors long before he learned to shave. Beside him sat Private First Class Eugene Kerr, a wiry kid from Oklahoma whose primary qualification seemed to be an unshakable optimism that bordered on the absurd. They had been tasked with route reconnaissance, mapping passable roads for the advancing columns, when they encountered the abandoned Panther blocking the narrow forest path. Dalton brought the Jeep to a halt 20 yards away. The two men stepped out, boots crunching in the snow, breath clouding in the January cold. Kerr walked forward slowly, circling the immense machine as if it were a sleeping predator that might wake. The Panther's turret was traversed slightly to the left, its long cannon drooping earthward. Frost clung to the vision ports. There were no bodies, no signs of combat damage. Just a tank too heavy for the ground it had tried to cross, now wedged at a 15-degree angle in a roadside ditch. "We can't leave it here," Dalton said, his voice flat with the pragmatism of a man who had learned not to be impressed by size. "Battalion needs this road clear by 1400. Kerr looked at him as if he had suggested they fly. "Hank, that thing weighs 50 tons. We've got a Jeep." "I can see that, Gene. A Jeep. You said that already." Kerr gestured helplessly at the Panther, then at their vehicle, then back at the Panther, as if the absurdity would resolve itself through repetition. But Dalton was already walking back to the Jeep, unreeling the tow cable from its mount behind the rear axle. The cable was standard issue, 3/4-inch steel, rated for recovering light vehicles and pulling supply trailers. It had never been designed to move. A main battle tank. Dalton knew this. He also knew that Wehrmacht recovery vehicles were scarce, that American armored recovery vehicles were miles behind the advance, and that orders were orders. He hooked one end of the cable to the Panther's towing shackle, a heavy steel loop protruding from the rear hull. The other end he secured to the Jeep's rear tow hitch, a fixture that had been welded on as an afterthought during production. Then he climbed back into the driver's seat, shifted into low gear, and began to apply throttle. What happened next would be recounted in after-action reports, in letters home, and decades later in the fading memories of men who could no longer believe it themselves. The Jeep's engine, a 134 cubic inch 60 horsepower inline 4 that would have seemed comically inadequate in any other context, began to scream. The rear tires, wrapped in chains for winter traction, bit into the frozen mud. The tow cable went taut with a metallic groan. For a long moment, nothing moved. 50 tons of German engineering sat unmoved, anchored by its own mass and the frozen earth. Then, almost imperceptibly, the Panther shifted. An inch, then another. The track that had been buried began to lift, shedding clods of frozen dirt. The hull tilted, rocked, and suddenly broke free from the ditch with a sound like thunder dragged through gravel. Dalton kept the throttle steady, the Jeep crawling forward in first gear, and the Panther followed. Slowly, grudgingly, the 50-ton machine rolled back onto the road, its tracks leaving deep parallel scars in the snow. 30 yards, 50. Dalton pulled it clear to the shoulder, where it would no longer block the advance, then stopped, set the brake, and stepped out into the cold. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply stood there, staring at what they had done. "Jesus Christ," Kerr finally whispered. Dalton unhooked the cable without ceremony. "Get on the radio. Let battalion know the road's clear." But the story did not end there. Because 4 hours later, 7 miles to the east, it happened again. The second Panther had not been abandoned by choice. Its crew, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Reinhardt and his 4-man team, had been attempting to reposition during the chaotic retreat following the failure of Operation Wacht am Rhein. The tank had veered off the road to avoid an American airstrike, and in doing so, had driven directly into a concealed culvert hidden beneath the snow. The right track had dropped into the depression, canting the entire vehicle at a 30-degree angle. The engine was still running, the crew still aboard, but every attempt to reverse out had only driven the track deeper. They were stuck, and worse, they were exposed. Reinhardt was not a young man. At 34, he was ancient by the standards of the Panzerwaffe in 1945, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Kursk and the long, bleeding retreat westward. He had climbed out of the commander's cupola and was standing beside the immobilized Panther, smoking a cigarette with the slow resignation of a man who knows when the game is over, when the sound of an engine reached him, another Jeep. This one crewed by a lieutenant named Paul Strand and a driver named Corporal Vincent Makek, both from the same 7th Armored Reconnaissance Unit. They had been following the route Dalton and Kerr had cleared, pushing eastward to probe German positions. When they rounded the bend and saw the canted Panther, its commander standing in the open, Strand brought the Jeep to a halt and reached for his sidearm. Reinhardt raised both hands slowly. He did not drop the cigarette. "Kaput," he called out in heavily accented English, gesturing at the tank. "Finish, no fight." Strand kept his .45 leveled, but did not fire. Around them, the forest was silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. The war was nearby, but not here, not yet. Matzek glanced at the Panther, then at Strand, then back at the Panther. "Sir, we can take them prisoner, but we need to move that tank. It's blocking the route." Strand did not lower his weapon. "Radio for a recovery vehicle." "Sir, the nearest one is 8 miles back. We're supposed to maintain the advance." Reinhardt, still standing with his hands raised, spoke again. "You have rope? You pull, yes?" He gestured at the Jeep, then at his Panther, and smiled. A thin, bitter smile that said he already knew how absurd it sounded. Strand stared at him. "Pull it? With that?" "I see happen," Reinhardt said. "Other road. Here on radio. American Klein's auto pull Panther from ditch. I not believe. Now I see you have rope, so maybe I believe." For a moment, Strand did not respond. The implications were too large, But Maciek was already moving, pulling the tow cable from the Jeep's storage mount. Reinhardt, sensing permission, barked an order in German. His crew, young men, exhausted, filthy, no longer soldiers in any meaningful sense, climbed out and stood in a ragged line, hands empty. One of them was crying quietly. Another simply sat down in the snow. Maciek hooked the cable to the Panther's rear shackle. Strand ordered Reinhardt and his men to sit under guard, then climbed into the Jeep's passenger seat. Maciek took the wheel, shifted into gear, and began to pull. Once again, the tow cable went taut. Once again, the Jeep's tiny engine screamed in protest. And once again, impossibly, the Panther moved. The right track clawed its way out of the culvert, the hull rocking, grinding, protesting every inch. But it came, slowly, agonizingly. 50 tons of German armor followed a Jeep, 1/20th its weight, back onto level ground. Reinhardt watched in silence, his face unreadable. When the Panther was finally clear, Maciek shut off the Jeep's engine. The silence that followed was absolute. "Got him, Himmel," Reinhardt whispered. "It is true." The news traveled fast. By nightfall, both incidents had been reported up the chain of command, passed along in disbelief, recorded in unit logs, and radioed across the divisional network. Within days, the story had reached Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper that served as the voice of the American armed forces overseas. The headline was simple: Jeep Tau's Panther twice. The article was light, almost humorous in tone, playing up the underdog nature of the achievement. But for the men who read it, and for the Germans who heard it through the grapevine of captured prisoners and intercepted communications, the implications went far deeper than a funny anecdote. To understand why, one must understand what the Jeep represented. The Willys MB and its Ford-produced twin, the GPW, were born from a 1940 U.S. Army requirement for a light reconnaissance vehicle. The specifications were ruthlessly practical. Payload capacity of 600 pounds, four-wheel drive, a wheelbase under 80 inches, and a price point low enough to mass produce. Willys Overland won the contract, and by 1945, over 640,000. Jeeps had been manufactured. They were everywhere. They carried generals and mail, ammunition and wounded, towed artillery, and pulled supply trailers. They forded rivers, climbed mountains, traversed deserts, and they cost less than $1,000. But the Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a symbol, an inadvertent ambassador of American industrial philosophy. Where German war machines were marvels of engineering, painstakingly crafted, often hand-fitted, expensive in both resources and time, the Jeep was the opposite. It was simple, mass-produced, interchangeable, and expendable. It embodied a kind of mechanical democracy, good enough for any task, cheap enough to lose, ubiquitous enough to be everywhere at once. And that ubiquity, that sheer overwhelming abundance, was something the Wehrmacht could not comprehend. German soldiers had been told that American troops were soft, dependent on luxury, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that defined the German warrior. They had been told that American equipment was shoddy, mass-produced junk that would collapse under the rigors of real combat. And then they encountered Jeeps that refused to break, rifles that fired in conditions that would jam a Mauser, rations so plentiful that frontline troops threw away food, and an industrial base so vast that losing 1,000 tanks was not a catastrophe, but a logistical inconvenience. When Reinhardt sat in the back of an American truck that evening, hands zip-tied, heading toward a POW processing center, he tried to explain it to the young private guarding him. "We think you are weak," he said haltingly in broken English. "Rich, yes, but weak. Fat boys who won't go home. We think German soldier is hard. American soldier is soft. But you..." He gestured vaguely at the convoy around them. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, all moving in perfect disciplined columns despite the snow and the darkness. "You have so much. Always so much. We count bullets. You throw away bullets. We fix tank many times. Hope it work. You throw away tank, get new tank. How we fight this?" The private did not answer. He was 19, from Pennsylvania, and he had no answer to give. But Reinhardt's question was the same one being asked in bunkers and command posts across what remained of the Third Reich. How do you fight an enemy that can afford to be wasteful? How do you defeat a nation that treats a main battle tank, being towed by a utility vehicle as a minor curiosity rather than a propaganda miracle. How do you maintain belief in superiority when the evidence of inferiority is everywhere? The Panther, for all its technical brilliance, required 150,000 man-hours to produce a single tank. If it broke down, and it often did, plagued by transmission failures and engine fires, it required specialized parts, trained mechanics, and time the Wehrmacht no longer had. The Jeep required 350 man-hours. If it broke, you cannibalized another Jeep. If you lost one, 3 more arrived the E. Next day. This was the arithmetic of total war, and by January 1945, the arithmetic had become theology. There was a moment, recorded in a letter written by a German lieutenant named Erich Hohenstein to his wife in February 1945, that captured the psychological impact of these encounters. Hohenstein had been part of a battle group retreating through the Eifel region when his unit came across a destroyed American supply depot. It had been hit by artillery, and crates of rations, ammunition, and equipment were scattered across a muddy field. Hohenstein's men, starving and desperate, descended on the wreckage like locusts. What we found there, he wrote, was not the scraps of a defeated enemy, but the refuse of an empire that did not know scarcity. There were crates of food, meat, chocolate, fruit in tins, enough to feed my entire company for a week, and this was what they had abandoned as damaged or unnecessary. There were spare parts for vehicles I had never seen, boots in every size, medical supplies we have not had in months, and there, half buried in the mud, was a Jeep. It had been hit by shrapnel, its hood torn open, one tire flat. My men wanted to strip it for parts, but then one of them, a mechanic, climbed inside and turned the key. The engine started. This broken, abandoned, forgotten vehicle started and ran as if it had just rolled off the factory floor. We stood there, listening to it idle, and I think in that moment we all understood that we had already lost. The Jeep that towed the first Panther never became famous. It was repaired, refueled, and sent back into service, where it continued to perform the mundane tasks it had been designed for until the war ended 3 months later. Dalton and Kerr were never decorated for their improvisation. It was not the kind of act that earned medals. The second Jeep met a similar fate. Strand was promoted to captain for his performance during the final push into Germany, but the incident with the Panther was never mentioned in his citation. But the Panthers themselves, those symbols of German armored might, were catalogued, photographed, and eventually scrapped. One of them, the first that Dalton had towed, ended up in a collection depot in Antwerp, where it was examined by Allied intelligence officers trying to understand the mechanical failures that plagued German armor. The report noted that the tank was in otherwise excellent condition, that its engine had been well maintained, that its crew had done everything correctly. It had simply been too heavy for the ground it was trying to cross, and its designers had never anticipated that a vehicle 1/20th its weight could be used to recover it. The symbolic weight of that oversight was not lost on the officers who wrote the report. By the time the war ended in May 1945, over 360,000 Jeeps had been deployed across every theater of conflict. They had served in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of the Pacific, the bocage of Normandy, and the ruins of Berlin. They had become so ubiquitous that soldiers stopped noticing them the way one stops noticing the air. But to the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the Jeep was a revelation. A small, seemingly insignificant machine that represented everything they had been taught to despise and everything they had failed to understand about their enemy. It was not the strength of the Jeep that defeated them. It was the fact that there were so many Jeeps that strength became irrelevant. In the decades that followed, historians would analyze the fall of Nazi Germany through the lenses of strategy, leadership, and ideology. They would write volumes about Stalingrad and D-Day, about the failures of the Luftwaffe, and the genius of Allied logistics. But buried in the footnotes, in the after-action reports, and the memoirs of ordinary soldiers were moments like these, small, absurd, almost comic instances where the mythology of German superiority cracked and fell away. A Jeep towing a Panther, twice in one day. It should not have been possible, and that impossibility, that shattering of expectation, was more demoralizing than any defeat in battle, because it revealed a truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure, that the war had never been about who had the best tanks or the bravest soldiers. It had been about who could build more tanks, feed more soldiers, and sustain the crushing, grinding, inexorable weight of industrial total war. And in that contest, there had never been any doubt about the outcome. Reinhardt survived the war. He spent 2 years in a POW camp in Mississippi, where he worked on a farm and learned passable English. In 1947, he was repatriated to Germany, where he found his hometown in ruins and his family scattered. He never spoke much about the war, even to his children, but late in his life, in a conversation recorded by a grandson researching family history, he was asked what he remembered most clearly from his time in combat. He thought for a long time before answering. "The sound of the Jeep," he said finally. "That little engine. We would hear it everywhere, always, in the forests, on the roads, even at night. And every time I heard it, I knew we had lost. Not because it was dangerous, because it was everywhere, because they had so many, they did not even care. You cannot fight that. You cannot beat everywhere." On January 17, 1945, in a frozen forest in Belgium, a 50-ton Panther tank was towed out of a ditch by a vehicle that weighed less than a single one of its road wheels. 4 hours later, it happened again. The men who witnessed it did not understand the full significance of what they had seen. They were too cold, too tired, too focused on survival to grasp the symbolic weight of the moment. But history has no such limitations. History sees the Jeep and the Panther and understands what they represented, the clash of two philosophies of war, two visions of what made a nation strong. One believed in the perfection of the machine, in the superiority of engineering and design. The other believed in the multiplication of adequacy, in the power of enough being better than best. And on that frozen January day, adequacy hooked a tow cable to perfection and dragged it out of the mud. Twice. The snow continued to fall that evening, covering the tracks, erasing the scars, burying the evidence. By morning, the road was clear, and the war moved on. But somewhere in the collective memory of the armies that fought there, the story remained, passed down, embellished, doubted, and retold. A small, impossible victory that meant nothing and everything. Because in the end, the war was not won by the tanks that could not be moved. It was won by the Jeeps that moved them anyway. If this story of impossible odds and shattered assumptions moved you, honor these forgotten moments by subscribing to our channel. Hit the like button to ensure these voices from history continue to be heard, and turn on notifications so you never miss the untold stories that reveal the real face of war. Share this with someone who needs to understand that victory is not always about strength. Sometimes it is about simply refusing to believe that something cannot be done. The men who towed those Panthers deserved more than anonymity. Let us remember them together.